Hi everyone, this is Terry from Tangerine Mountain Imports and Designs, your kimono vendor with you every year at Anime Iowa. Now unfortunately, we can't be together with you this year, but we love you, we miss you all, and we wanted to work together with the staff at Anime Iowa to bring you some kimono-related cultural content. So this segment is about how kimono are made. We're going to take you from the bolt to the finished product. So sit back, relax, and let's learn a little bit about garment construction. Many times people want to learn how to make kimono because they're cosplaying a character that wears kimono. And you might want to look at that cosplay from a more authentic perspective, as opposed to just buying something that is going to fall apart on you in the middle of a convention. Kimono are a little bit sturdier than some of the things that you might get from, say, Amazon. Now, another thing too that people want to learn when they learn how kimono are made is they want to learn kimono from a fashion perspective. This is not something that's generally taught in Western schools. So this whole area of garment construction has a completely different philosophy than with Western garment construction. Now there's another reason too why it might be interesting to learn about kimono for you, even if you don't intend to actually make a kimono yourself. The techniques that we're going to be talking about here are very eco-friendly. Kimono construction uses just about every portion of the fabric on the bolt. This is radically different from Western garment construction, and it makes sense because the bolt for the kimono is constructed specifically with the kimono in mind. Now, textile waste is a major part of the pollution that is sitting in our oceans. We talk a lot about plastic waste, but textile waste is actually a really big deal. So if you can take some of the techniques that are used in making kimono and find ways to incorporate them into any other kind of garment construction, I think you'll find that some of your fashion ideas might end up being less wasteful, a little bit kinder to the environment. Now, before we bust out some bolts and start talking about the parts of the kimono, let's talk a little bit about some of the features of the kimono that are created as it is stitched together. One of the things that's important to remember is that no matter what, the kimono is going to be wrapped so that the right-hand side goes down first and then the left-hand side goes down on top. Now, it can be difficult to keep that in mind if your kimono has the same pattern all over the fabric. For a kimono like this one that has certain design elements clustered in a certain area, it makes it a little bit easier to remember that procedure as you're wearing it. An important thing to remember for kimono construction is that if you spread out the kimono in the way that we have here, this part to my right here, to the right, is called shitamae. This part is the underneath portion. So this is the bottom layer. This is the layer that's closer to your body. Typically, this does not have as much decoration, at least if you're talking about kimono over the last, say, 120 years maybe. Now, the other side here, off to the left, is the umamae. This part is the top layer of the kimono as it is worn. So this part is typically going to be more decorated, especially if you are using if you're doing a woman's character, and if that character is wearing something that's relatively formal or very formal like this kimono is. Now, of course, one of the most prominent features of any kimono is the sleeve, this characteristic boxy sleeve. Now, the sleeve has many features that help to distinguish things like age and gender and marital status, depending upon the type of kimono you're constructing. That said, at Tangerine Mountain, we are very inclusive. We want people to be comfortable wearing whatever is best for them to wear. You are the expert in your body, not us. And we also support people cosplaying, utilizing kimono, whether it's a character that appears in the show wearing kimono, or it's a character that you want to visualize in a kimono, maybe a character that never appears in kimono. So either way, we want to make sure that you're free to cosplay how you like. So if this information about the sleeves pertains to you, great. If you just want to design your kimono with the sleeve closed regardless of gender, that's something that we've seen in modern fashion from places like AC/DC Rag and other designers too. So it's just something to keep in mind. the parts of the kimono are going to stay the same pretty much regardless of the type of kimono. Now, it's important to know what the parts of the kimono are, because if you're working with an authentic bolt, you're going to need to know where each part is going to start and stop, and that's sometimes a little bit difficult to tell. Now, there are 8 basic pieces of the kimono, not counting the lining, which complicates things, so we're going to talk about that later. The 8 pieces are the 2 sode, which are the sleeves. Then there's the migoro, which is the 2 body panels. These panels go all the way up over the shoulder and drop down on the other side, so they come all the way around the front of the body. Then there are 2 okumi. The okumi are half panels, and these are the panels that are at the front of the kimono that cross over each other so that you're not flashing everybody as you're wearing the kimono. There are 2 more parts after this that are probably the most complicated parts to stitch together to form the finished product. And those 2 parts are the eri, which is the collar. The collar actually starts all the way down here, which is going to correspond roughly to the hip line. And it's going to come all the way up and to the other side of the kimono, all the way over here. So that's the eri. That's one long piece. Then there's one additional piece called the tomo eri. And the tomo eri helps to create a line that you'll often see, especially if you watch anime, you'll see a line that's sort of drawn horizontally almost along the collar that reaches around the back of the neck and comes around, and it just stops right about the sternum level. That's the tomo eri. So those 8 parts make up the kimono bolt, and those are the 8 parts that you need to focus on if you're going to either use an authentic kimono bolt, or if you're going to take Western fabric and cut it into narrow strips to help simulate what these parts are. So now that we've taken a look at the finished product, let's talk about how we get there. A kimono like this starts as a bolt. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about these bolts is that they're not the same size as your typical Western bolts. That's because the fabric is woven specifically to be the width of a kimono panel. Now, the piece behind me is a more formal type of kimono, so it only has certain design elements in certain places on the kimono. The more common everyday kimono are going to have bolts that look sort of like this yukata bolt, where the pattern is all over the fabric. This is a summer kimono bolt, and as we can see from this bolt, the pattern is repeated throughout. It's easy to visualize what the final kimono is going to look like based off of just glancing at these bolts. The pattern is very obvious. So if you're constructing a kimono that ultimately is going to look like this komon, as you can see, has the same pattern throughout. So this komon originally started just as a bolt, and then it was constructed in this finished piece. Now, of course, if you're in Japan and you happen upon a kimono shop, you can buy a bolt of kimono fabric, bring it home, and construct a kimono out of it. You can also work with companies like ours to get bolts from Japan into the United States. Now, if you're in Japan and you want to order a kimono from a kimono shop, you might be presented with some kind of a sample bolt. So this sample bolt contains various komon patterns, different fabrics that are all stitched together. A sample bolt like this might be used to help show the capabilities of the weavers that the kimono shop works with, or they might actually be small pieces cut from the actual bolt so that customers can choose from them. So for this particular bolt, I really like this one because it shows some very typical patterns, some of these striped patterns, but there's also some really nice fun ones like this ichimatsu or this checkerboard blue pattern here. So this just gives you an idea as to some of the everyday fabrics that you could get in a kimono from a nice shop. Sample bolts like this one are a lot of fun to collect because they show the artist's talent across many kimono. Typically, one bolt is one kimono, but these sample bolts really stand out because you see the designs from multiple kimono represented all in one rolled up portfolio. In addition to kimono sample bolts like these, at a bespoke kimono salon, you might also be shown a loosely stitched together kimono. And that is because if you fold up this particular piece, you can just see that there's just plain fabric here. You're not going to get an idea as to the designs that are all in strategic places on this kimono. Because this kimono is loosely stitched together, you can get an idea as to what the contiguous design looks like on the finished product. This design would be very difficult to understand if it was broken up along various segments of the rolled bolts. Because it is put together like this temporarily, you're able to get a much better appreciation for the whole design. Now this karinui has a price tag on it of about $1,600, and it would have been for this exact kimono, not a copy of it, this specific kimono. We have it, of course, because it was damaged and I was able to take it and use it as a teaching tool. But if you were to buy a piece like this from a salon, or even just on the internet or from a company like ours, you can take the loose basting stitches that hold this together apart and then use your own measurements to tailor the kimono to your own body. We'll talk a little bit more about how that's done later. This bolt is for a komon. A komon is an everyday type of kimono that has the pattern all throughout the kimono. So there's no design elements that appear in certain places along the body. This bolt, on the other hand, has design elements in certain places. And so what we're going to see as we unroll this bolt is that all of those design elements had to be thought of in advance so that they could be dyed on the bolt in strategic places. So this involves both some math as well as the ability to take an image and then break it down into different panels so that you can place it where it should go along the kimono. The first piece of this bolt is the sleeve. Now, the front of the sleeve is meant to be blank, and the other side of the sleeve facing the back is what's going to have design on it. Now, this cloud design is going to be part of the rest of the kimono. We're going to see this design echoed throughout. As we unroll the other sleeve, we're going to see how this design is intended to continue onto the next panel, onto the migoro. Now we're going to unroll the migoro. Okay. And here is where we're going to see how this starts to fit together. This is where that pattern from the sleeve from earlier is going to join up. Now, of course, we're going to allow for some seam allowance, but if we bring the sleeve back, we're going to see how this all fits together. It's almost like we've designed the kimono as puzzle pieces that then need to be put together to get the finished piece. So in other words, all of the design elements are put on the bolt and then everything is put together at the end. The same thing is going to be true for the ends of the body panels. One of the things that you find very quickly if you work with a lot of kimono bolts is that it becomes very easy to get lost in 10 to 12 meters of fabric. Here we are. This Migoro panel has the design for the cloud, which is going to run into the Okumi panel, which is going to be next door. The design is going to be sweeping around the body. So this part of the cloud, you can see it's cut off here. It's going to run into the next panel. You can also see where there is less dye to indicate where the Migoro ends and the next Migoro begins. Now on this bolt, we don't have the neck cuts because this bolt was never even made into anything like a karinui. This is a fresh bolt. It was never constructed. But this is the length of our Migoro here. And as we can see, the two ends are different. We have a lot of pattern here, and not as much here. When you put the two Migoro together, you're basically constructing the side seam of the kimono that starts from the underarm and runs to the very bottom of the hemline. Now again, allowing for seam allowance, we can see how these two pieces, as they are stitched together, would form one contiguous cloud pattern that starts to wrap around the body. Moving on, we're going to see the next Migoro. And we're going to see the same kind of thing. One side of the Migoro is going to match up to a spot further down the Migoro. Placing these two pieces together, and again, allowing for the seam allowance. I'm going to match them up. We can see that these two are going to join together to form a contiguous cloud pattern. Now we've reached the part that I think best illustrates how the design elements have to be planned out on the bolt and then executed on the bolt so that you can then construct the final kimono. This is the section that deals with the 4 half panels, the 2 okumi, which are the front overlap panels, and then the eri and the tomo eri, which are the 2 collar parts. As we can see here, there's a break in the pattern in the middle of the fabric. So this is intended to be cut. We do have the bottom part, which is where basically we know to cut between this part of the panel and then the bottom of the Migoro. As we continue along, we're going to come across a little bit more cloud because this is the other okumi panel. So this is the one for the front panel, the part that you're going to see. So this is going to be the left-hand side. This other okumi is going to be for the right-hand side. Now, I want you to pay attention to something as I show you how the okumi are laid out on the bolt. Here we have the bottom facing this side, and here we have the bottom facing this side. So they're not quite mirror image, but they're fairly close. If you are working with an authentic bolt that is designed like this, your best bet is to take the panels, and again, this is why it's really important to know on the bolt where the pieces are, because you don't want to accidentally think that, let's say, this is part of the tomo eri and cut it short here and then realize, oops, that's the okumi. But you're going to basically take this part of the bolt and cut it right in the middle. You're going to match up your 2 okumi and cut it in the middle. That way you know you have the right length. The eri and the tomo eri, remember the tomo eri is going to be shorter than the eri. So once this is cut in half down the middle, you're going to have one long strip. For this kimono, the eri and the tomo eri are all this cream color. So it basically just means you're going to base where to cut off of your own measurements. One of the main points about kimono construction that I'd like you to remember is that the kimono is put together in such a way that you could unstitch it, take all of the pieces, lay them out end to end, and base them together and recreate the bolt that it came from. So that's what this is. This is basically a reconstituted kimono bolt from 8 pieces of kimono. We're going to lay this out so that you can see how these pieces fit together on the bolts. To start off with, we have the sode, which is the sleeve. Given the age of this piece, the sode on this bolt is actually a little longer than you might see in a modern kimono. Now, something that I'd like you to note is that for the sode, again, no seam at the top here. You might find exceptions. Some modern designers sometimes play with this, but no seam at the top. Where this is cut is where you would have that seam. Basically, these ends here are stitched together to form the bottom seam of the sleeve. It's a nice technique because even though we're used to seeing seams at the top of the shoulder and at the top of the arm in the West, it creates a very nice drape. As we continue down the bolt, we're going to find, of course, the other sleeve. And then we're going to get into the migoro, or the body panels. Now, the migoro panels are going to be very long. And that's because, once again, we're not putting a seam at the top of the shoulder. So this migoro panel is going to be just about twice your height. Okay. This migoro panel, I've got both layers of it right here, so it's long. One of the most tricky things about putting a kimono together is the neck cut. Now, typically on a reconstituted bolt, and in fact, you can kind of see a little bit the basting stitches that I cut. I snipped these basting stitches because I wanted to illustrate in another presentation just how this neck cut is formed around the collar. The neck cut is the most difficult part about putting the kimono together. And it's a part that people don't see if you're just looking at a kimono. You wouldn't know to put this here unless you had seen a deconstructed bolt like this. We're going to talk a little bit more about how this works later. For now, we're going to keep going down the bolt to get to the other parts. So we've come across the other migoro. So we've done one side of the body and here's the other side. These pieces are just going to be essentially mirror image as you construct the kimono. So you'll have a neck cut along here and a neck cut along here. This one's still stitched. Continuing on the bolts, we're going to reach a point where it almost looks like we have a little bit of a fork in the road. But that's because we've come upon the part of the kimono that involves half panels. I'm going to unroll it just a little bit further here. Basically, at this point of the bolt, once we've done the sleeves and the 2 body panels, we're going to come to a point where the bolt is going to be cut, and then you're going to have half panels all the way down the rest of the bolt. Those half panels are then divided, but they're divided a little differently because each half panel corresponds to a different part. On this side of the bolt, so we're talking, as I hold it up to you, the right-hand side. This is the okumi. Now remember, the okumi are the narrow half panels that form the overlap on the kimono. So the okumi side, again, going long ways, pretend that this part here doesn't exist. The okumi are going to be the same length. So I'm going to bring the two okumi together. And we're going to see that here, this panel and the panel beneath it are the same length. The okumi come up alongside the body, and then they're going to join with the collar. We'll talk more about that later. For now, we're going to look at the other half of the bolt lengthwise, because this part is cut not at the same place where the okumi panels are cut. We have one small segment, and this forms the tomoeri. So remember that the tomoeri is the part that comes around the neck and starts to cross over. So this is the over collar. The remaining quadrant, although they're not even quadrants, is the eri. The eri is the collar. So this is how long this eri is. As you can see, the tomoeri is only this long, the eri is considerably longer. And that's because on the finished kimono, this is going to come around the back of the neck. It's going to cross the body, crisscross. So that's this part of the kimono here and over here, crossing over to the back of the neck. Now we come to the neck cut. As you can see, as I hold up the karieba here, if you don't create an opening for your neck, if you don't make some kind of a cut, you actually have no place to put your head. Since we like having a place to put our head, we're going to make a cut along the migoro on each side. Now, this karieba does not have the collar with it. In the West, we would probably just make a cut. We would probably just taper this migoro so that we have the slant for the collar, and therefore this could just wrap around the body and look fine. But that's not how we're doing things. We're doing things with a neck cut. One of the advantages to doing the neck cut is that the way that you join the collar to this cut allows for the collar to sit up. It gives the collar more of a three-dimensional effect than if you just tapered this alone. It basically enables the collar to stand up nicer along the neck, and it also makes it possible for you to wear a nagajuban underneath that, especially for women, gives you a drape to the nape of the neck. So if you didn't have that collar standing up the way that it does, the kimono wouldn't exactly fit the same way that it does if you're trying to be authentic. We're going to demonstrate a little further how this works utilizing this komon bolt. I've got this cut open here. I'm going to fan this out. The way that the migoro fits on the body, this cut is actually spread. It's not kept together. So when this cut is fanned out, that enables us to attach the eri and work it around the cut. So essentially, you're sort of treating the cut as a straight line and stitching the eri to it. In order to better illustrate this, I'm actually going to pin it. And you might find that you need to baste it in place before stitching. Several basting lines are not uncommon. So here we can see that already the fabric is starting to pop up in the collar section. This is going to, again, enable, as this moves around the neck, this is going to enable the collar to sit up nicely. It basically helps to be a three-dimensional portion of what is otherwise considered a completely flat garment. Now, what about the rest of the collar? How is that attached? Well, the first thing to know is that you want to get the rest of the pieces of the kimono assembled, and then you worry about the collar. So this is really one of the last things that you're going to do as you put together an unlined kimono. Now, a quick word about the tomoe construction. The tomoe, remember, is going to come around the back of the neck. It's layered on top of the eri, and it's going to end right at about the sternum. Now, I've seen the tomoe attached to the eri in a variety of ways. Honestly, one of the best ways to see how you want to do it is to take a kimono apart yourself and see how it's done. But I've seen the tomoe just wrapped around the eri and just attached with a very small line stitch. I've also seen the tomoe folded at the seam allowance and then tucked under the seam allowance of the eri, and then stitched almost as if it's one piece. A lot of times I think the tomoe is attached to the eri first, and then the eri/tomoe piece is then attached to the kimono. But I've also seen it where sometimes the tomoe seems to be attached on after everything else is done. It really just depends on what you're most comfortable with. All right, so let's put everything together in order. The first step is going to be to get your design elements in the right places along the fabric. You want to put the designs on first before you stitch the fabric together. It's going to make sure that everything lays nice and flat and smooth when you assemble the final piece. From there, you're going to attach the migoro panels to each other along the side seams. You're also going to attach them to the okumi in the front, and you're going to attach the sleeves. So you're going to get all of this stuff done first before you worry about the collar. As you can see, the middle of the collar lines up with the middle back seam where the two migoro attach. It continues on and it slopes down. It slopes down the front. It crosses the migoro and the okumi above where the tomoe ends, typically. The okumi is going to continue straight. This is a rectangular panel that we want it to be able to be reconstituted. So it's a rectangular panel that stays rectangular. Underneath this collar, the okumi is just folded. That's all it is. Once that collar is stitched, then you're done. Now, part of our goal at Tangerine Mountain is to bring not just kimono to the United States, but also knowledge about kimono. So we've amassed a collection of books that continues to grow related to the construction of kimono, the different techniques used to create the design elements of kimono, and more. This book has a list of the pieces that would be used for the lining of the kimono, which we didn't really get into too much, but the lining pieces are going to look a lot different than the rest of the pieces of the kimono because they are a little bit more cut to the right size to fit into the places in the kimono where they need to go. So if you would like an advanced project, then you can try looking at the inside lining of an existing kimono and pattern based off of that lining. But again, I would really stress that especially if you're making a kimono for cosplay where you might be very warm, I would probably suggest sticking with the hitoe. These two antique kimono construction books detail the way in which you would lay out the pieces of the kimono bolt. We have the sleeves, we have the body, we have the two okumi panels, then we have the two collar pieces. Over here, it's illustrated how you can fold a kimono bolt. In order to cut those pieces evenly, all you'd have to do is slide your scissors into the loop of each piece of fabric. This larger illustration helps you to understand how the pieces come together. You have your collar and your over collar. You have the two okumi panels. Then you have the migoro, the body panels. And then finally, on the outer ends, you have the sleeves. Thank you so much for watching. We hope you learned a lot about how kimono are made. We also want to thank everybody at Anime Iowa for allowing us to bring you this cultural content. And we hope that everybody stays safe and healthy so that we can see you all next year. If you would like to acquire a kimono of your own, or if you're interested in learning more about kimono, please visit us at www.tangerinemountain.com. Or you could check us out on social media at Tangerine Mountain on Facebook or Tangerine Kimono on Instagram. Of course, if you like this video, please share it with your friends. Please also hit the like and subscribe buttons so that you can receive more awesome kimono content. Thank you again so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.